we spent the morning and the first part of the afternoon hearing about anecdotal evidence on the benefits of employee ownership. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book with Professor Doug Cruz at Rutgers University, showing that firms with broad-based employee equity ownership provided greater employment stability to their workers during the recessions of 2001 and 2008. That is, when faced with negative shocks, employee ownership firms were less likely to fire their workers than firms without employee ownership. We looked at all publicly traded firms during this decade of analysis from 1999 to 2011, which included these two recessions, one of which was the Great Recession. We used the Form 5500 pension records from the Department of Labor. And I just want to give you a couple of numbers, some estimates of the effect of employee ownership, which we found. So we found firms without employee ownership in their defined contribution plans decreased employment by 3%, in contrast to firms with any employee ownership, which decreased employment by only 2.8%, and firms with any ESOPs decreased employment by only 1.7%. So the overall pattern here is that firms with employee ownership were more likely to retain workers, more likely to provide employment stability to their workers when faced with financial distress. We also found that employee ownership firms were more likely to survive through these recessions. Firms with employee ownership were only 78.6% as likely as those with no employee ownership to disappear over the decade that we analyzed. Furthermore, the share of the firm owned by employees had a big impact on firm survival. Firms where the share of the firm owned by employees was 5% or more were only 77% as likely to disappear as firms with less than 5% share of employee ownership. So what is the big picture here? We're finding that employee ownership is linked to greater employment stability and greater likelihood of firm survival through recessionary periods. And this means that there are strong positive externalities of employee ownership on the overall economy, which include things like reducing unemployment and thereby its harmful effects on communities, like higher crime and lower tax base for supporting infrastructure and public goods, lowering government expenditures on unemployment compensation and other forms of support for dislocated workers and economically stressed families, and boosting consumer purchasing power and aggregate demand for greater macroeconomic stability under recessionary pressures. Therefore, there is a clear justification for widespread government support to broaden the prevalence of employee ownership in our society. And so we support introducing tax policies that would create greater incentives for firms to adopt broad-based employee share ownership, and introducing programs that can spread information about the benefits of employee ownership and how employee ownership programs can be set up at firms. I want to conclude with just a couple of remarks about my most recent project using U.S. Census data. So here we're looking at the following question. When workers have ownership stakes in the companies where they work, does labor productivity rise? So for now, we're looking at this very specific thing, effect of ESOP adoption on labor productivity. We are looking at this fundamental question using the largest data compilation effort to date on employee equity ownership in the United States, where we're linking data from the U.S. Census and the U.S. Department of Labor. And we think that this is the next big thing for impact investing in ESOPs. We link workplace-level microdata from the U.S. Census Management and Organizational Practices Survey, the U.S. Longitudinal Business Database, the American Survey of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Department of Labor's Form 5500 pension database. because we're using confidential census data, we have to be very careful about what information we disclose. And there are a couple of results that have passed the census, U.S. Census's disclosure procedures. So I'm allowed to talk about them here. Specifically, we find that adopting an employee stock ownership plan is associated with a 10.7% increase in labor productivity from 2010 to 2015. This amounts to an average increase of 2.14% per year. This is very significant. Furthermore, a $100,000 increase in ESOP assets per active employee is associated with 6.47% increase in labor productivity. We also look at management practices at these workplaces and find that high performance workplace practices go hand in hand with the efficacy of broad-based employee ownership. Many of these results have previously been shown in other studies, but not using this very detailed census data that we now have access to. Thank you very much.